What do you call it? When a king locks his own son in a wooden box and waits 8 days for him to die. This isn't myth. This isn't metaphor. This happened in a palace, to a prince, in one of the most powerful royal dynasties in East Asia, and the echoes haven't stopped since. July 4th, 1762, the silence of the royal courtyard shatters like porcelain as a wooden rice chest slams down onto the stone tiles of Changdeokgung Palace. No drumroll, no announcement. Just the hollow, splintering sound of wood meeting stone and something alive trapped inside. Inside that box is a prince. His knees are pulled to his chest. His silk robe clings to him soaked in sweat and terror. His voice is muffled but clear. "Father, please, I can change." That voice belongs to Crown Prince Sado, heir to the Joseon throne. 30 seconds ago, he walked into this courtyard as royalty. Now he's been ordered into a box meant for storing grain. The same box that will become his coffin. There is no formal charge, no sword, no trial. Just the king, his father, standing stiff and tear-streaked, whispering a single command. "Bind it." Around him, ministers stare at the ground. Court ladies bite their sleeves to hold back sobs. The king's heartbeat is louder than the ritual drums, but his hands do not shake. Each knot tied around the chest is a lifetime of disappointment, rage, and unspoken fear. And inside the box, fingernails begin to scrape, wood against bone. Breath quickens like a trapped animal. The summer heat turns the box into an oven. The sound of scratching begins. It will continue for days. Open it, and your dynasty dies with him. That's the king's final warning. His voice like iron, his face like marble. The lid comes down. The rice chest is nailed shut. And so begins one of the most horrific true stories in royal history, not of war or conquest, but of madness, control, silence, and a death so slow it still echoes through Korean folklore and spiritual rituals. Because what happened inside that box didn't just kill a man. It ruptured a dynasty. It rewrote the soul of a kingdom. This isn't a ghost story, not yet, but it becomes one. The scratching never stopped. Not really. It just moved into rumors, into history books, into shamanic rituals whispered in modern soul. A sound no one wants to hear, but no one can ignore. So now we go back. Back to the child who was crowned before he could speak. Back to the haunted rooms where shadows whispered to him. Back to the thunder. Back to the silk. Back to the mirror. Back to the beginning of the boy in the box. The child who would one day scratch at the walls of a rice chest wasn't born in darkness. He was born into ceremony, into gold-threaded silence, into a throne he couldn't yet see. His story doesn't begin with madness. It begins with a body small, still, and royal lying on the floor of the Joseon court. 1735, Crown Prince Hojang, firstborn son of King Yongjo, collapses mid-lesson. One moment he's reciting Confucian texts. The next, his body sees his eyes rolled white. Hours later, he is dead. No cause given, no investigation opened. The court records offer only 5 words, an unexpected heavenly calling. But within the palace walls, the whispers begin. Poison, spirits, a vengeful curse. No one dares ask aloud, but everyone knows the death of an heir leaves a vacuum only a child can fill. So they find one. 15 months old, still learning to walk, barely weaned from his mother. He is dragged into a position older than time, wrapped in embroidered robes that weigh more than his body. He doesn't understand the ceremony. He doesn't understand the crown. He only understands that hundreds of grown men are bowing before him and that he's never been so afraid. Crown Prince Sado, youngest heir ever named in 500 years of Joseon history. And history would not forgive him for it. 3 days after his brother's death, the toddler becomes the living symbol of a kingdom's continuity. Ministers cheer, astrologers declare auspicious signs. The people celebrate. But inside the palace, servants cross themselves before entering his quarters. Because the place he will grow up in the Yaseondang Pavilion has a reputation. Only 2 years earlier, it had housed Lady Jiang, once the king's favorite concubine. But she was caught performing shamanic rites, burying dolls made of bone and hair beneath the floorboards, chanting curses meant for the queen. She was executed in that very building. Some say her screams stained the walls. Now they've placed a toddler there. The nurses notice things immediately. The child cries in strange corners. He reaches for figures no one sees. An old servant quits after just 3 days, claiming she saw a woman's silhouette moving behind the paper walls. But the court dismisses it as nonsense. After all, this is the Joseon dynasty, the height of Neo-Confucian enlightenment. Not a village ghost tale. But the pavilion remembers. It always does. Years later, while restoring the structure, workers would uncover carved symbols beneath the beams, protective charms hidden in the eaves, paper talismans dissolved into dust behind the floor slats. A desperate attempt to contain something. It didn't work. At first, things seem promising. The king visits his son often. He laughs when the toddler memorizes names. He bounces him on his knee and calls him the future of Korea. Sado learns to speak early. His memory astonishes ministers. By age 3, he can recite poems older than dynasties. But even then, the head nurse notices fractures. The child sometimes stops mid-play, eyes, glassy lips moving as if responding to an invisible whisper. His pupils dilate. He mumbles words in no known language. Afterward, he remembers nothing. The court physicians blame childhood fatigue. The ministers don't want to know more. But the servants talk. They say the shadows in the pavilion flicker at night. They say the boy isn't talking to himself. They say Lady Jiang never left. The rumors don't reach the king, not yet. What he sees is a brilliant child, hungry to learn, eager to please. So he begins the teachings early. By 3, Sado is attending state rituals. At 4, he is examined publicly. At 5, he is expected to answer questions about governance. And when he falters because he is a child, his father's face clouds. Wrong King Yongjo growls. The Crown Prince of Joseon does not make such errors. The court watches in uneasy silence as the child with silk robes and trembling hands is corrected for pronouncing a character incorrectly, for pausing before reciting military law, for smiling. Smiling shows moral weakness, the king says. So Sado stops smiling. By age 5, he is waking at 4 a.m. for calligraphy drills, standing on aching feet, for ceremonial bows, reciting names of dead kings and lost battles until his voice goes hoarse. When he stumbles from exhaustion, he is told weakness invites shame. When he cries, he is mocked. When he fears thunder, he is sent outside into the storm. Each tear becomes a test. Each test becomes a punishment. Each punishment becomes a prophecy. Outside the palace, the people still see a golden heir, a divine prince. But inside these walls, something else is growing. A boy no longer sure what's real. A boy who speaks to mirrors. A boy who hears footsteps when no one's walking. A boy who once whispered, "She says I'll wear fire," and burn the sky. They thought they were shaping a ruler, but what they were really shaping was a vessel. And something had started to fill it. By the time most children begin reading simple rhymes, Crown Prince Sado was reciting ancient texts from memory. By age 6, he could list all the kings of the Tang dynasty in order. By 7, he was expected to interpret legal philosophy in front of grown men who feared correcting the king, let alone comforting his son. But brilliance in the Joseon court was never enough. Perfection was mandatory, and in the eyes of King Yongjo, every mistake was a moral failure. The sessions grew longer. Public examinations held in the grand throne room became ritual humiliations. Ministers sat in gilded silence while a child barely able to hold up his robe tried to explain the balance of agricultural tax law. The moment he hesitated, the king would rise. Wrong, he would declare. Do you intend to shame your ancestors? When the boy cried, study hours were extended. When he collapsed from exhaustion, he was called lazy. When he showed fear, he was punished. Lady Hyegyong, his wife-to-be, would later write, "The king believed hardship forged strength, but all it forged was terror." At 5, Sado was blamed for a drought. When crops failed, the king summoned court officials and declared, "The prince's inadequacy has angered heaven." He said this with the boy kneeling beside him. At 6, Sado fainted in court. Mid-recitation, he collapsed to the floor unconscious. The court physicians found nothing physically wrong. His body was healthy. His mind, however, had started to protect itself by disappearing. It would not be the last time. The fainting spells became frequent, sudden, unprovoked, during a storm, during a ritual, during a punishment. Like his soul had learned to vanish when the pain got too loud. But the palace had no room for softness, and certainly no room for madness. That year, Lady Sun, his mother, tried to intervene. She snuck into his room late at night, brought him snacks, whispered poems, hugged him when he wept. For a few months, he smiled again. He spoke like a child, not a crown. The king found out. Lady Sun was banned from seeing him for 3 months. Her kindness was labeled corrupting. The boy's last source of warmth was removed. The light inside him dimmed. At age 7, he was told to compose a poem on filial piety. Standing before the royal court, eyes swollen from study hands, trembling from cold, Sado opened his mouth and said nothing. Seconds passed, then minutes. He couldn't speak, couldn't remember, couldn't move. The king screamed, "You disgrace, you shame this dynasty. You are unworthy of the crown." The tirade lasted an hour. Sado stood motionless, tears, streaming lips parted but voiceless. Witnesses said it was like watching something break behind his eyes. That moment, the silence, was the moment his reality began to fracture. What followed was not education. It was programming. It was ritualized cruelty disguised as tradition. When he turned 10, everything changed. That year, Sado discovered a book he was never meant to read, the Jade Pivot Scripture, a Taoist manual buried deep in the restricted section of the royal library. Hidden in dragon leather, smelling of old dust and incense, the text promised power, control, immortality, and most importantly, a way to commune with celestial beings. The boy who had been controlled for every hour of his life saw something in those pages, a chance to escape, a chance to matter. The ritual required 3 days of fasting, specific incenses, recitations of forgotten names. Sado followed every step. On the 3rd night, lightning split the sky. He said the thunder spoke to him. He described a figure massive, crowned in storm clouds, eyes like lightning. It did not speak in words. Its message burned into his mind. You are chosen. You are cursed. Power will come through pain. That night, thunder shattered ceramic across the palace. Servants found him on the floor, whispering in tongues. He wouldn't speak Korean again for 2 days, and when he did, he was changed. He began to fear the word thunder. He couldn't touch documents that contained the character. He'd burn any paper where it appeared. At first they thought it was a phase, a moment of stress, but then he began seeing the thunder god in mirrors, in still water, in candle flames. He'd scream and point. "He's here, no one else saw anything." Doctors were summoned. Monks were called. The exorcisms failed. The king predictably blamed weakness. When a storm came, he dragged Sado outside, made him kneel in the mud. "Face your fear like a man." Lightning struck a tree behind them. Sado collapsed, convulsing. The king didn't flinch. What began as fear soon evolved into obsession. Certain words became cursed, then colors, then fabrics. He'd rip off silk robes claiming they whispered to him. Servants rewrote state documents to avoid trigger words. The royal court became a linguistic minefield. Then came the burning. At first it was just robes worn during storms, then robes that had touched those robes. Soon entire wardrobes were reduced to ash. Sado watched them burn naked, whispering in languages no one knew. "I'm not suffering enough," he said once. He says the real punishment hasn't started. The palace, once a symbol of order, was now ruled by the unpredictable rhythms of a prince who heard gods and saw curses. And yet, no one stopped him. Because madness in a peasant is an illness, but madness in a prince is called mystery. The boy had been broken, the vessel had been filled, and the storm was only beginning. They thought the worst had passed, that the storms had calmed, that the prince had outgrown his visions. They were wrong. Because when the thunder stopped, the silence became worse. He no longer screamed, no longer tore his robes or cursed the gods aloud. He whispered, he smiled, and he began spending long hours alone with blades. One morning, a servant girl was found behind the rice granary. Her eyes open, her throat slit, her arms folded across her chest as if posed. The court was told it was a suicide, but her hands were tied. That afternoon, Prince Sado ordered the kitchen to serve nothing but white rice for 3 days. When questioned, he replied white for purity. She was clean when she died. The officials dismissed it as coincidence. Lady Hyegyong did not. She wrote, "My husband's mind had become a hall of mirrors, each thought reflecting another until he could no longer tell which one was real." Then came the royal tailor, a man with no enemies, no scandal. One night he delivered a robe, red silk, flawless work. The next morning his body was found hanging from the rafters, but the rope hadn't broken his neck. He had bled out. His fingers were missing. Sado explained, "He pricked my robe. The god asked for his hands." Lady Hyegyong begged the king to intervene. The court physician said he needed rest, not punishment. But rest didn't stop the disappearances. Servants vanished. Stable boys found dead in water troughs. The palace cats disemboweled and left in ceremonial lines. Each death more symbolic. Each body arranged like offerings. At night, people heard him pacing, whispering, scratching, always scratching. He scratched the floors, the doors, the inside of drawers, his own arms. By now the palace whispered of demons, of ancestral curses, of a dynasty cracking from within. Lady Hyegyong described one night in terrifying detail. She awoke to find Sado sitting at the foot of her bed, staring at her. He was wearing a woman's undergarments. His hair was unbound, his nails stained red. He whispered, "The god said I'll be queen next." And then he laughed, not like a man, not like anything she knew. That same week, he summoned a eunuch to his chamber, locked the doors. 2 hours later, he walked out naked, covered in blood. The eunuch was never seen again. No one asked questions, because by now everyone was afraid. Afraid of Sado, afraid of the king's silence, afraid that the heir to the throne had become something inhuman. And yet the court did nothing. Because Sado was not a criminal, he was a prince. And power shields its own until it's too late. Then came the dressmaker's child, a boy of 8, bright, talkative. One day he laughed at Sado's hat, called it silly. That night he disappeared. When the mother wept and screamed, Sado brought her a gift, a box wrapped in silk. Inside was her son's toy flute, and a note I taught him silence. She lost her mind. The court still said nothing, because they weren't dealing with a man anymore. They were dealing with a curse wrapped in royal silk. Lady Haegyong wrote, "There was no longer a line between dream and waking, no boundary between pain and ritual. The gods he feared had become the only voices he trusted." She tried to leave. She was forbidden. She tried to send messages. They were intercepted. She watched as her husband descended deeper into a faith only he believed in. He wore robes backward, spoke in riddles, sacrificed chickens on the roof of his chamber. Once he set fire to his own bed, then lay in the ashes, said the heat cleansed the screams. By now the king knew, but to admit his son was mad was to admit the dynasty had failed. So he did nothing, and Sado kept killing. When the palace finally acted, it wasn't out of justice. It was out of fear that he would one day wear the crown. Lady Haegyong would later testify in trembling script. He was not born a monster. He was raised into one. And by the time we noticed, it was too late. One final entry in her memoir reads, "He asked me if I would burn with him. I said no. I said our son still had a future, and that more than any murder, more than any scream, was the true horror. Because madness was no longer just his. It had infected the air, the walls, the bloodline itself. No one was safe, not even time. Because centuries later, researchers would study his journals, his drawings, his ritual notes, and they found the same word written again and again, scratched over and over like a curse. Inside, 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 where the god waits. They say it ended with a chest, but that's not true. It began with silence. It ended with legacy, and the echoes never left. On July 4th, 1762, under orders from King Yongjo himself, Crown Prince Sado was summoned to the royal courtyard. He was offered a final chance to take his own life. He refused. So the king chose another path. A large wooden rice chest measuring about 4 feet in length and just under 3 feet tall was brought forward. It wasn't built to contain a prince. It was built to store grain, but in that moment it became the coffin of a bloodline. Sado was ordered to climb in. He obeyed. No chains, no shouting, just scratching. Lady Haegyong wasn't allowed to watch, but she listened. She heard the lid close. She heard the nails driven in. She heard the first scream, and then the scratching. It lasted for hours, then days. According to court records, Sado survived inside that chest for 8 days in the sweltering summer heat. There was no food, no water, just his breath, his guilt, and the god inside his mind. He clawed at the wood until his fingernails tore off. He whispered to no one. He recited poetry in reverse. He laughed. And then, on the 8th day, he went quiet. But the scratching continued. The guards burned the chest after removing his body, but even then they claimed it creaked at night. Lady Haegyong later wrote, "I have never stopped hearing it. Every silence sounds like wood being scratched. Every quiet moment becomes his grave. But death didn't end the story. Sado's name was erased from royal records, his portraits removed, his crimes never discussed again. The official story became one of illness, not madness, not murder, not silence. Because in monarchies, the truth is too dangerous to write down. And yet the wound remained. Lady Hyejeong was forced to raise their son, a boy who knew his father had vanished, but not why. A boy who would grow up to become King Jongjo. A boy who would carry his father's name in secret. Who would later return Sado's title, erect a shrine, and say he was not a monster. He was my father. And I will not let memory be buried with the chest. But by then the damage had been done. A palace filled with shadows. A royal family haunted by whispers. A dynasty forever marked by a truth too twisted to confess. And that's the horror of royal silence. It doesn't kill the past. It feeds it. It passes it on. To the next generation. To history. To us. Centuries later, historians would revisit the memoirs of Lady Hyejeong. They found a woman trapped between love and horror, loyalty and fear. They found a prince raised in pressure, drowning in ritual, consumed by an unseen fire. And they asked the same question we ask now. Was he mad? Or was this a story of one broken man? Or a system that built a gilded cage so tight that anyone inside would go mad? Lady Hyejeong's final lines say, "At best I married a man, but watched a god take him. The court feared his madness. I feared their silence." The difference was this: one screamed, the other smiled. And now, whenever someone walks the grounds of Cheongdeokgung Palace, they say you can still hear it. Not a scream, not a voice, just a soft, steady sound like fingers against wood. Like someone still waiting, still scratching. That's the price of silence. It doesn't erase horror. It buries it just deep enough to echo. And so we ask you, would you survive 8 days in the dark with nothing but your mind? Would your lineage survive you? Or would your name become another locked box in history? Leave a comment below. Because this isn't just a story about a prince. It's about power, control, and what happens when no one dares speak the truth. Some stories end with a period. This one ends with a locked chest. Not just of wood, but of memory, of shame, of questions no dynasty dares answer aloud. Crown Prince Sado didn't just die in a box. He became the box. A symbol of every unspoken truth, every buried trauma, every family secret locked away for the sake of appearances. And maybe that's why his story still echoes. Because we all have something we're not supposed to talk about. That moment when someone we loved became a stranger. That silence after the scream. That fear that madness isn't something you're born with, but something you inherit. If you've ever questioned your own mind, if you've ever feared becoming the version of yourself others whispered about, then this isn't just a story about a Korean prince. It's about you. And here's the twist: Sado was silenced. But you don't have to be. The comment section is open for you to speak, to reflect, to ask the questions history buried. To wonder, was Sado the victim of madness or monarchy? Would he have survived in another time? Or would we have locked him up again? Leave a comment. Tell us what stayed with you, what disturbed you, what made you question everything. Save this video if you need time to process, and subscribe if you believe some stories should never be locked away again. Because silence is what killed Sado. But remembering, discussing, witnessing, that's how we bring him back. Not to suffer, but to be understood. So the next time you hear scratching in the dark, don't look away. Don't dismiss it. Ask instead, what truth is trying to escape? And will you let it out?